You're listening to the Barcode Podcast with your host, Chris Glandon, serving cybersecurity straight up with no chaser. Let's hit the bar and grab a drink.
Big Tone, what's up, my man?
All right, hey, Chris. The real Tony's off today. I'm Deepfake Tony, but you can call me Phony.
Dude, I couldn't even tell. Barcode is stepping up their tech game in 2021, I see.
For sure, man. We installed IoT beer taps for power flow control, voice-activated remotes, beer mat sensors, and I even pour using a smart jigger now, just because I can. How about I connect you with a Long Island IoT?
Sounds risky, but hook it up.
I got you. Using my smart jiggers, a half ounce of vodka, half ounce of rum, half ounce of gin, half ounce of tequila, half ounce of triple sec, 1 ounce sweet and sour mix. Shake it, pour into a glass of ice, and fill it to the top with soda.
This is an amazing drink. I need to start investing in deepfake bartenders as a service.
No, definitely a wise investment, bro. That's just my opinion. Until we get those really smart AI guys in here, then I'm sure they'll find a way to figure us out.
No doubt. Okay, man, thanks for the drink. I'm off to catch up with the security expert. He's going to be meeting me here any second.
Cool. All right, man. We'll see you next round.
Today, I'm here with Grayson Milbourne, Director of Security Intelligence at OpenText. Grayson, welcome to Barcode. What's going on?
Hey, Chris. Not too much. Happy to be here.
So for those that don't know, OpenText acquired Carbonite and Webroot about a year ago. Would you mind telling us how long you've been with the organization and also a bit more about your role at OpenText?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work for this SMB and consumer division of OpenText, which includes Carbonite and Webroot. So Webroot was actually acquired by Carbonite at the end of 2018. And then in 2019, Carbonite and Webroot were acquired by OpenText. But I have a long history with Webroot. I worked for that company since 2004, and I've spent much of my career as a malware analyst and eventually kind of climbed through the ranks and became the director of our threat research team at Webroot, and have since moved on into a product role where I focus on ensuring our products are capable of providing efficacy against the most recent types of threats that we're observing in the threat landscape. I also do a lot of thought leadership, and hence why I'm on this podcast. I like to talk about cybersecurity. I like to educate people, and so this is a great vehicle to do such.
Yeah, man, for sure. And I appreciate you bringing that knowledge into the bar. I have to ask you about the impact of COVID on business. How has it affected you and your typical day-to-day workflow?
Yeah, so I personally, I did a lot of travel, before COVID, and through that, I also worked from home a lot. And so I was already personally in a kind of a 50-50 in the office, out of the office split. And so now I'm just 100% out of the office. And I guess I'm somewhat fortunate in that I have a home office. And so working remotely for me hasn't been that much of a challenge. If anything, I know my wife loves it a lot more since I'm always around, and our pets as well. From a company perspective, being in software is actually a pretty great thing for working remotely compared to several other businesses that, really require more of that in-person availability to operate. So it was actually pretty surprising. Within about 2 weeks, OpenText, which has north of 15,000 employees globally, transitioned to a work from home, to where we had like 97% of our workforce working from home. And of course, like with how bad COVID is in the United States right now, we're still in that, almost everybody is working from home. But ultimately, that's actually been pretty good for business, because we did close several offices, and I think I'm sad about that. And I know several of them are not planning to reopen. But I also then think about, did we really ultimately need those offices? And certainly I like the person-to-person connection. And I think, Zoom and Teams and other platforms that give you, a piece of that. But what I'm really looking forward to is, getting beyond the pandemic, and even if offices don't reopen, I know at least OpenText, and I expect other businesses to sort of do similar, but we're going to reinvest some of those savings into offsite get-togethers. So, we still have that social connection that, is also very important in building and gaining trust and flushing out ideas that often just don't happen during the scheduled work meetings.
Yeah, it's very hard to translate that over a virtual meeting. There's a human element there that just can't be replicated.
Right, like the conferences, and hence this podcast. I think of course, going to the conferences for the content is the primary goal, but I would say very close behind that is the network building and going to the after parties and just having the social element of things. I mean, come on, we're human. That's part of what we really love about life. And when you can blend work and pleasure together like that, I think that's where real success happens.
Yeah, no doubt. So for those organizations that plan to continue the work from home structure post-COVID, what are some of the risks they should be primarily focused on?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the things that we're not going to see once the vaccines are out and we're largely over the pandemic is that we're just not going to go back to a 90+% in the office presence. And I know from OpenText perspective, they're aiming somewhere around a 50-50 split, and having offices for the things that we need it for, but not requiring employees who could easily work from anywhere having to come into the office. And so certainly with COVID, we saw a rapid. I feel we were actually moving this way already. And what COVID did is I think it fast forwarded us about maybe 5 or 10 years. But pretty much overnight, most companies had to become software companies to some respect. They had to start supporting like a VPN for their employees to connect to their home resources. And so basically, like the home became the new perimeter. And so for businesses to secure their workforce, they've had to scramble quite a bit to provide that. And I think even today we're pretty far away from businesses feeling very confident that their work from home employees are as secure as those that would be in the office. So I think there's a lot of challenges there. And I think one of the big ones is just personal devices versus managed devices. And it's easy to use your managed devices when you're at the office. You have your desktop PC there, or I did a lot of traveling. So I had a work laptop, which is great. It was small, but there's no way that I want to work day in and day out on my little 13-inch laptop. And so, at home, I have my personal PC, and we have surveyed lots of our customers to kind of get a gauge on this. And it looks like north of 60% of work from home employees are using their personal devices to then connect to corporate resources. And this is often done through a VPN and then a remote desktop connection. And again, just kind of what our data shows is, and this shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody, but consumer devices obviously see considerably more infections than their business counterparts. We use our personal devices differently. Managed devices have, all of the security that the IT team wants to protect those devices. And so really one of the big things we saw was that as work from home employees started installing VPN softwares to connect into their corporate networks, those devices were already infected. They didn't have that same level of updates and being kept current with important patches. And so they ultimately just really introduced a soft point for access into corporate networks.
Interesting. So let me ask you then, do you think BYOD will become more relevant then because of that?
Yeah. And so this is kind of where I'm expecting industry to pivot and provide solutions to solve this problem. And I think it's, when we first started thinking about BYOD, I think it was like largely thinking about mobile phones and how do we kind of bridge this gap of the risk of mobile devices. But now I think really like D is my PC more than it's maybe my cell phone, just because I can do so much more on my personal device. And so I think it's like, how do we manage personal devices? And I think there's lots of options. Obviously, Windows provides lots of flexibility here. And you could have several domain accounts on a single PC. And I think it's just, having a conversation with remote workers and saying that, hey, we want to be flexible. We don't want to make life working from home worse. But if you have a device you'd prefer to use, let's just go through the creating an account on that device that we can then at least install managed security and provide some data protection so that you reduce that risk of compromise through providing flexibility of using, preferred device.
Right. And depending on the end user, it could be a foreign concept for them. So you also need to provide that clear communication and deliver the message of that initiative properly.
Yeah, and I think users largely are also concerned about privacy, and they the reason that their personal devices see more infections isn't solely because of the security that's on those devices. We use our personal devices however we want, and when at work or using a work device, we're pretty much focused on this is a work device, so let's use it for that purpose.
Yep, absolutely. So strictly from a home user perspective and concern for their own privacy while being connected to their corporate network via VPN, what controls could they implement that their organization may not specifically point them to?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just having the conversation initially and just explaining that, we are concerned about cybersecurity risk. And I think certainly 2020 has already given us, some great reminders of how important, cybersecurity is to protecting business IP, protecting business assets. And so I don't think most employees should be that surprised to be engaged by their IT team to have this conversation. But I think that's kind of like the first step is saying, hey, let's bridge this gap. Let's make sure that everybody's staying secure here, and we want to help. And it's not a privacy thing; it's a security thing. And of course, those things are kind of on opposite ends of the spectrum. But I think with transparency of what you're protecting, that your employee should feel confident. And of course, if the employee doesn't want to allow you to manage their personal device, then you can say that, hey, well, we have a policy that you need to use a managed device for example, for connecting to corporate network resources. So I think it's a conversation that is just going to become the new normal because working from home has so many advantages, and as businesses see that employees are happier, they have more free time, they have more flexibility, and ultimately, I think it also it opens up the job pool of candidates. And I know a lot of businesses shed some employees in this past year and are really looking forward to regaining some of that headcount and rebounding. And when we think about relocating and some of the complexities that go into finding the right job, I think working from home really, or working from anywhere, as I like to call it, gives us that flexibility to not need to relocate and still be able to be effective. So I think overall, I mean, this is kind of just we're in the very beginning of defining this new procedure for how we connect to our corporate environments. And I think one thing maybe to pivot on here is the home network. We've talked so far a lot about devices, but I think the device challenge in some ways to me seems easier to solve with software solutions and account creation that's specific to the task. But then when we look at the home network, there's so much more diversity and complexity, I think, there. So I think that's kind of where I'm excited to see industry kind of pivot and attempt to solve that home network security challenge, which I think also creates a great opportunity to educate the employee base. And, instead of users looking at their home network router as a black box, maybe getting familiar with that piece of hardware and understanding what it does and what it provides you as far as visibility into what's going on in your home. Which again is even more important nowadays when almost every new device that you buy for your house, whether it's an appliance or a TV or a receiver or anything that pretty much requires electricity, nowadays comes with an internet connection and the ability to remotely manage it, which is really cool. But most of these things are never built with security even in mind, as an afterthought sometimes. And, because of this, we've seen, lots of IoT botnets and things that are able to, easily propagate and taking advantage of firmware that's exploitable. And then, what ultimately makes me nervous is so many of these apps or IoT devices are connected to your mobile phone through an app that they have you install. And again, the security and thoughtfulness about that, is often not there. And so what we see is, very poorly secured IoT controlling apps. And then when you think about that device that's on the network, it knows passwords to get on the network. It's aware of the other devices on the network. And it ultimately just, again, it creates like a soft spot for exploitation.
Yeah, I agree. IoT is developing at warp speed. What developments do you see happening with IoT in 2021?
Yeah. So, I think IoT security has been on the radar for quite a while. And there's definitely no question that consumers, love these devices. I see that only accelerating. And ultimately just in the ways in which we're able to add technology to things that maybe didn't have them before. And so one of the areas that we're seeing a lot of that is in wearables and smartwatches and smart health devices. And, it's cool to be able to track my light bulbs and turn those off remotely, but all of a sudden I have all this biometric data that's, being uploaded to a cloud and, it has a very intimate knowledge and awareness of myself. And so I look at that as something that really absolutely has to be security forward as we move forward with benefiting from these devices. Yes, it's great to be able to track this information, but security in that space is critical. And so there's several ways in which we can go about this. One of the things I like is having standards and I've been an advocate for a security standard for IoT devices. So it's kind of like something like Energy Star for your refrigerator or your heater, so that that it takes into account energy savings. So if you had something else that was a security standard protocol that ensured that the devices were able to auto update, that they took proper security practices in place, and had like an entity to validate that, would then, as a consumer, I would probably maybe shell out a couple extra bucks to buy an IoT device that I knew cared about protecting my data.
Definitely. It could be an IoT security verification check.
Right. I mean, especially when we start getting into really sensitive data. Like, I'm sorry, but I just wouldn't trust wearing a biometric device that uploads data to a cloud that, like so much of compromise occurs because of our trust of somebody else to do it right. And so when how many times has a password of yours been hacked or leaked because the website that was holding it stored it improperly and got compromised, right? Like this is not a rare occurrence. And with biometric data, I think that's something that, personally, obviously I work in this industry. Like, privacy is very dear to my heart. And, I love the benefit of technology, but at the same time, I think, we have to be careful about the trade-offs we make.
Very true. And yes, a verification system is much needed.
Yeah. We'll have to see where it goes, but I think like something like that is going to be needed. And it's also, I think, attractive to the consumer. So that combination typically leads to something happening.
Yeah, absolutely. So what other challenges do you see us facing within the next year?
Yeah. So, after 2020, I am really looking forward to 2021. So, but I think it still introduces a lot of new challenges. And based on what we've seen so far in 2020, the fact that we're not past this pandemic, there's several things that I expect to see. And one is that the skills gap is going to continue to widen. And that's unfortunate. And I think this is a skills gap that has been widening for several years, actually nearly a decade. And I think that's a challenge. And especially it's exacerbated by all of these companies now having to have an IT department or hiring an MSP to provide that remote connectivity for their workforce. So, that creates an opportunity. I think whenever you have a skills gap, of course, you want to train and build that back up. But it also creates a great opportunity for industry to create solutions to help solve that gap. And I think, Webroot, for example, has been in that business for a long time. And many of our focus is on supporting those SMBs and MSPs with easy to use solutions. We primarily play in the endpoint protection game. One of the emerging technologies for the last several years has been EDR solutions, or what I would call maybe like XDR, because it doesn't necessarily just need to be focusing on the endpoint. Really, for things to be effective, you have to have that cross-platform visibility. So being able to understand endpoint type of like MITRE ATT&CK framework event type of data, but not only just looking at the endpoint, but looking at cloud and looking at network to ensure, and even mobile, to basically be able to tie the dots together for when something has really slipped through. And unfortunately, I think the challenge with these solutions, like to date, has been the volume of event data. And so I think what we're really looking at is how do we make sure that when an event takes place that might be suspicious, that we don't overwhelm those who are responsible for monitoring it and taking or controlling that software. So, if you need a dedicated SOC team to manage your EDR, is that necessarily solving your problem? And maybe for enterprises it is, but I think the SMB space is also heavily under focus. And so I expect to see improvements in these technologies that really reduce the number of false positives. And then the R side of like response. And I think R has always been very undersold in these solutions. They're like, hey, these are the problems, but how do I respond to it has often been neglected. And I think largely because these solutions are focused at the enterprise level, and they expect to have an IT team or SOC team that knows how to respond. But I think when we start looking at the lower market, these are solution providers. Like MSPs don't want to have to write the response plan. And I think these solutions are going to continue to mature so that we'll see better response, like an all-encompassing solution that says, okay, it looks like you may have been compromised. Here's what we can tie together. Here's likely when it happened. Here are the resources that you need to validate, and kind of giving like a playbook for how to respond to security incidences.
Yeah, that would be nice. Let me ask you about cybersecurity spend or tool investment. What would be your advice to organizations in terms of what their top priority should be?
Yeah, so I think like I have lots of opinions, I think, in this answer. one thing that I think is far underserved for our businesses, employees, is just education. And when I think about when on an annual basis, I have to go through so many different mandated training courses for compliance. And it's silly to me that there's not a cybersecurity compliance standard, largely because, the users are often the target, right? So if they get tricked into clicking on something or take a phone call and get tricked into doing something, that's how so many attacks begin. So I think one of the things I like to see more of is just educating the workforce about the threats that they face, and keeping it current. Not to pitch our products, but one of the things that we invested in several years ago was kind of leading the effort in this. And we have a security awareness training platform that allows you to send out phishing attacks against your employee base, and has lots of templates that we keep very current with examples from the wild. So we're in a constant process of discovering these types of email-based threats and phishing attack tactics in the wild, and then very quickly turn them into templates that companies can use. And what's actually interesting about it is, now that we've had this service out for over 3 years now, we can look at our customer data again just to kind of gauge the efficacy. And so there's one way to look at the efficacy is in that when we start sending out phishing simulations against a business, initially people are clicking about 30% of the time. And after they've done maybe 4 or 5 trainings, so we recommend doing it on a monthly basis, just a little, stress test against your employee base. But after 3 or 4 times, click rates drop below 10%, which shows that employees are getting smarter. But how does this really ultimately, equate into the bigger picture? And when we look at our customer base, for example, that uses our security awareness training and our endpoint solution, they see 90% less infections. 90% less infections than, an equal part of our customer base that doesn't use security awareness training. And it's for me, it's man, if you could just take a 90% reduction because you invested a little bit in educating your workforce about, because the threat landscape moves very quickly. We see, within minutes of a news story being broken, you're going to find sites that are going to index quickly to the top of Google searches that are malicious. And then we also see it seasonally. So right now we're going through open enrollment and for health insurance and things like that in the United States. And so we see every year clockwork, email that attempts to take advantage of that, and they know it's difficult. Spam filters struggle to block things that are very, very similar to normal email. So I guess I would start with education, right? I think that's the one of the least expensive and most effective ways to improve cybersecurity. And it really also fits along with this working from home, right? Let's reinvest in making sure that we're all a little bit more cybersecurity aware, understand how our routers work, understand the importance of clicking yes, update, and restart, and monitoring your browser, making sure your browser's up to date. I mean, it's not a very hard list of things to do, but I think if you go through it, it really makes a huge difference in security.
Yep. So tooling's important, but it's not the silver bullet.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I wouldn't only rely on education, but I think, MITRE's attack framework has been out for a couple of years now, and I think it does a great job of showing all of the creativity. And right, that document continues to grow as we see new evasive tactics used by threat actors. And I think it provides a good framework for, understanding some of the critical points to have visibility. So especially with things like RDP, we see RDP as a entry point for compromise so often. And if you phish the right person's credentials and you can get in, and this is the use case we see often is that, they'll eventually get to a domain admin account, and then they'll disable all of the antivirus. They'll disable all of the backup solutions. They'll do the reconnaissance and steal the data. And then they'll deploy, with a policy update across the entire network all at once, ransomware. And that could all be prevented with stricter remote desktop protocol access enforcement. So obviously 2FA is one thing that's important to do. And I'll just touch on that one real quick, because one of the things that we've seen, again, improperly done is 2FA is an effective strengthening tool for authentication, but it needs to be device separated. And what I mean by that is that, on my home PC, if I connect to our VPN, I could install the second factor authentication token generator on my same PC, or I could install it on my phone. And it's it needs to be on my phone, right? Because if my device were compromised and somebody can then just see my PIN, all of a sudden, if they were able to remote access my machine, they could then make that same connection without needing my personal device to get that PIN. So it's like using 2FA properly and effectively. The other thing with RDP is just setting the access limitations and access restrictions, so that if we see like RDP was developed without any sort of brute force mitigations by default, and so setting accounts to lock after like 2 or 3 missed password attempts, and also just having visibility into where do people connect from. And so there should be some patterns that look normal, and then should stick out if somebody's connecting from normally from this IP range, and all of a sudden they're somewhere else. So there's lots of little things you can do to improve remote security, but I think that's a big one that we ask our customers to really try to lock down.
So cybercrime as a service is expected to rise at an unprecedented rate this year. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, one of the biggest things that we see, so there's several big botnets that are out there, but one of the ones that's been the most resilient to take down is called Emotet. And it's been around for 5+ years now. And initially it started off as a botnet that really just aimed to collect information about the devices that it had infected. And it's sort of matured through its success and its ability to propagate. That they now operate as cybercrime as a service. And so it's easy enough to get in touch with these guys and to request the ability to deploy a malware. And so typically this is just done through providing remote access to compromised devices. And they certainly work with some groups much more than others, but you'd be surprised how inexpensive some of these credentials can be. And so what will happen is basically there's different levels of like hacking organizations. You have very well organized groups all the way down to, your script kiddies and those, teenage hackers who are, maybe trying just to explore more than really to try to create harm. But you often start with trying to gain access. And so, gaining access can sometimes just be as easy as purchasing credentials. Remote access protocol will get you right in. And then basically you can kind of go from there. And depending on what you see in that environment, we see either ransomware or in many cases, if there's not a lot of value or not expected value, we just see remote access Trojans and things that collect data. Or other times we'll see, financial based Trojans and things that look to collect or interfere with the browsing experience. But yeah, I don't know. It's one of these things that we see still very effective using social engineering as a tactic to propagate. And so, for Emotet as an example, typically starts as a spam email. It has an attachment, and we see a lot of right now using exploiting UPS and FedEx and all the delivery services as their bait, because here we are close to Christmas, and they know that people are, hey, did somebody send me something? Do I got to click on that tracking link? Should I open this document? And so they're pretty effective at getting people to basically install the infection. And then once it's installed, it gathers information, other email contacts, and basically then sends itself on and propagates that way. But through that, they have millions of infected devices, and those can be used again for like a DDoS, for example. And this is really more, I think, for the larger organized crime syndicates that have more resources to maybe launch a DDoS attack at somebody. Oftentimes DDoS attacks they're not really done for profit. They're really more done for disabling something or taking something offline as there's several reasons to do that.
Exactly. It could just be someone out for vengeance.
Yeah.
So what's your take on ransomware at the moment? You see these extremely advanced ransomware variants. Now you have one that will send the ransom note to your printer.
Yeah. So, I think I've been following ransomware for a very long time. I remember, the early crypto lockers, and even before that, really what we saw was fake AV, and AV that would try to tell you you're infected. And just through this evolution, we've seen a lot of tactical changes. And, certainly over the past 5 years since kind of the dawn of crypto locker and all the evolution since then, we've seen so many different things the free file, to show that it works, tech support. Most recently, I even saw cold calling. And so, I forget the particular ransomware variant, but, they would start calling people, or organizations that they had infected, to over the phone, try to convince them to pay the ransom. And so every year, what we see often is a rebranding. So, there's probably north of 200 different named variants of ransomware, and it's probably a bit higher than that by this point. And so, rebranding is just a tactic to to make yourself look new and different. And often through that process, we see some improvements in the overall functionality of how the ransomware operates. And so, ransomware obviously a very devastating type of attack to suffer. And so lots of technology has come out to try to identify that, to try to prevent that. And so, what we've seen is ransomware are, they're shifting their tactics to use what we call living off the land binaries. We've seen ransomware attacks that are entirely script encapsulated, that use only Windows components to generate the two key pair for encryption, to index the files, to do the encryption, to generate the note. All of that was done really without introducing any application to the environment. So we're starting to see those types of tactics within the application itself, or within how ransomware is achieving its goal. But we've also seen shifts in who ransomware actors are targeting. And so for the last several years, and I think we'll continue to see this, but focusing on the soft targets, things like government agencies, schools, hospitals. But oftentimes those are not very high paying targets, right? Hospitals don't have deep pockets. Local government agencies don't have deep pockets. Certainly hospitals do not. If they really want to haul in a bigger payload, what we started to see are pivots towards manufacturing. And so getting into the middle of like a supply chain of manufacturing, if you can interrupt the right thing, you then set people downstream from you, and all of a sudden you have a maybe more motivation to pay quickly. So, we see that with ransomware specifically in the past year, definitely.
How about looking at the recent COVID vaccine cold chain attack? Do you see ransomware emerging there?
Yeah, that's interesting. And certainly, oh boy, can you imagine if like Pfizer or like Moderna got infected? They would probably pay. And it's interesting. We saw some really big ransomware payouts in this past year. Garmin got hit in June, I believe, and they paid out $10 million. And then we saw Foxconn get hit just a couple of weeks ago, and they paid out $34 million. And I was like, man, that's a lot of money. But I didn't realize actually how big of a company Foxconn is. And they reportedly made, or in revenue, like $178 billion last year. And of course, revenue is not profit. But then when I started doing some math, I'm like, wait a second, $34 million is like really small change to them. Like if you really wanted, why didn't you ask for like 100 million? Like even 100 million for a company that makes 178 billion annually is again, it's like, it's not as, I don't know. So I honestly predict in 2021, we're going to see 100 million or better ransom paid. I certainly expect like phishing campaigns and these things to continue to use COVID, especially with the vaccine. And, unfortunately, we're just not out of this mess yet. And, cyber criminals definitely love newsworthy events. And we're just kind of living in this perpetual newsworthy event that they're going to continue to exploit.
Yeah. Speaking of newsworthy event, SolarWinds has just completely taken over my Twitter feed.
Oh, I know. I tell you what, my last week has been, it's been interesting. And honestly, it's almost like, how did 2020 not end without this, right? So like there had to be some sort of cybersecurity, nightmare that was on par with everything else in 2020. And man, if SolarWinds isn't that, then I don't know what is. And it's been interesting as we've looked, and still, there's a lot to learn, and a lot of companies who who have certainly been impacted that haven't come clean about it. But to me, I think what's scary about this is, again, it's that it's the trust of somebody else, right? And SolarWinds had a lot of very big clients, and those clients trusted that SolarWinds was protecting themselves against this type of an attack. And like all too often in the past, that trust broke down and cost a lot of people becoming compromised. So it's, for what I find really interesting about this is like that it went unnoticed by SolarWinds, because we've had a little over a week now to analyze the samples that are related. And in some ways, that what's nice about this is, SolarWinds Orion network monitoring software is written in .NET, and that's great for analyzing the code, because it's very easy to take .NET binaries and look at the source code. And so, when we go, and SolarWinds is a big company, right? Like their Orion software has been out for a long time, and so when we started going back and looking at all the variants of the specific DLL that got compromised, you can kind of see the timeline for when, the malicious class was entered into the DLL. So that actually happened in November of last year. And then it wasn't until March of this year that the class basically was introduced, the namespace is introduced, but laid dormant and empty for 5 months. And then the threat actors then, introduce the malicious code. And so to me, it's like, okay, well, there was already, like, why did that happen? Like, where's the QA process in here to review these things? So like, I guess like in some ways, like to me, it feels like almost like an inside job to some degree. Like I'm not surprised, like if attribution ends up being another nation state. But I scratch my head when I look at our internal development process. Like I just don't see how something like this could have happened. And I think it's causing a lot of security software companies to look internally and make sure that they haven't fallen victim to something similar. And really, like that's what we're kind of looking at. Again, we have to see what happens and what's released, but it's looking like VMware may have also been compromised. And if you think about what could be worse than a SolarWinds compromise, it would be a VMware like sandbox escape vulnerability. And to me, that would be that's probably, I'm like, what could be worse than that? If you can imagine how reliant we are on VMware.
Yeah, Cisco was affected as well. I don't know if you saw that.
I did. I mean, I saw this morning the list of people that they've now identified. They basically brute force the DGA for the C2 server, so they can see the various. It's part of the URL string that they communicate back and forth with that contains the identifier for the company.
It'll be interesting to see how this investigation plays out and if we'll get to see any indictments.
Being under cyber espionage this is not new, right? Like, I think from a federal agency perspective, the government's done a really poor job, going all the way back into the 2000s till now in providing proper punishment for these types of attacks. Because I mean, at this point, like this was very much like cyber espionage, right? Like all these people wanted to do was learn and take and listen. The no ransomware is deployed, right? I mean, this was just a big listening operation. But, I don't think there's a way to even put a dollar amount on the intellectual property loss that, these companies have suffered. So, supply chain is certainly something that I think we're all going to look very closely at as we move forward into 2021 and beyond.
I've taken notice to an increase in attackers abusing law bins. Could you explain what a law bin is and how attackers can leverage law bins in fileless attacks?
Yeah, exactly. So like they're called living off the land binaries. And so living off the land is a technique that's been popular for several years now. But, so much technology is focused on how something new is introduced. But sometimes nothing new is introduced, and really all you're using is the embedded functionality within Windows. So if you think about, there's actually a very long list of what we call lol bins that can be used as part of an attack to achieve, the goal of the attacker. And probably the most notorious would be PowerShell. And we always advocate that if you don't need PowerShell, then disable it for your users because that application itself has so much capability. And so others are like script interpreters. So, some of the scripting languages that are supported natively by Windows. You have like WMI, so the Windows Management Interface or instrumentation. And this again gives you just lots of flexibility into setting policies and basically, I mean, through these tools, and there's several others, like you can build an entire executable on the device without ever having to say extract it from a website or getting it there some other way. And so, I think what's challenging about this is that these are all good processes. They're digitally signed by Microsoft. They are, for all intents and purposes, a good application that then could be used for malicious purpose. And so what we're starting to see is, I talked a little bit about this with how ransomware is taking advantage of these to fly under the radar. And so I think industry has been faced with the challenge of how do we have the proper visibility into these applications, and how do we properly secure them for the proper use and detect the malicious use. And so we've seen a lot of innovation in that space, particularly around like script detection and improper. It's almost like heuristics. It's like should Java write an application to an apt data temp directory, or should Windward be allowed to open up PowerShell and download a file? And so there's lots of like ways that we see commonality in how these things are used, but a lot of technology still doesn't have the visibility into them. So without that, you're kind of at risk to attacks that take advantage of lol bins.
I see. It sounds as if detection could certainly be a challenge there.
It can be, absolutely.
Would ML or a UBA-based tool help with detection?
Yeah, I think like ML can help to some degree. I mean, so part of what we've been looking at is just the variety of command data that comes through these types of applications. And so, we have things that we look for that we say like PowerShell shouldn't be allowed to do this, or WScript shouldn't be allowed to do this. And so, for us, we've been really looking at, there's a lot of commonality is the thing. And so I guess in some cases, or in a lot of cases in cybercrime, code reuse is a pretty common thing. And so, somebody figured out a way to do it and then, copy and paste types of attacks. And so, even though, things could be easily obfuscated or changed, we see a lot of that. But I also think like, UBA is understanding like what should something be doing and when is it outside of its expected behavior? And then how do you then ultimately provide protection? So, okay, something is now done something wrong. Is it too late? Do I have to have a reaction plan? Or, was this something I was able to stop preventively? So I think that, when we look at, more on the definition side of an approach to, okay, like this type of command shouldn't be executed. That's easy to do. But when you look at, behavior and analytics, sometimes that's after the fact. And it's like, okay, hey, this thing was outside of its bound. Oh, something has happened, right? As opposed to, no, you're not allowed to do this. So, I think it's somewhere in the middle. And I absolutely think ML is going to play a big role in, this, again, like the challenge here is like sifting through the big data. And I think that's really where ML shines. So I expect that type of technology to refine and strengthen these solutions.
Got it. Well, staying on the topic of AI, I've always been fascinated with deepfake technology, although you don't typically see it being used by attackers. Why do you think that is? And when do you think we will start seeing deepfake attacks?
Yeah, so I couldn't agree more. I think deepfakes are fascinating. They're also frightening. Humans obviously wired to see and hear and trust, and when that can be manipulated so easily to have people obviously say things that they didn't really say. So far we've largely seen this for misinformation or for comedy, and unfortunately I think it's going to start making its way into compromises. And really where I see this is not necessarily with video deepfakes, but with audio deepfakes. And one of the biggest threats that we continue to see, and didn't talk a lot about this for what I expect in 2021, but this is certainly one of the big ones, is business email compromise is a really costly type of attack, and it's a largely social engineering attack. And it costs U.S. businesses north of $2 billion in 2020, and I have no doubt that that's going to grow in 2021. But to combat that, what businesses are doing is they're increasing verification processes. They're having a second set of eyes. There might be get on the phone with the CFO and make sure that you have authorization and everything is right. And so it's almost in that space that I see deepfakes being used. And there's a I forget the name of the site that does this, but you can upload a small amount of audio recording, and it can generate an audio model that you can then type into, and it will speak.
Yeah, I think it's called Lyrebird, and it used to be open source, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and it doesn't take much, right? So, I mean, if you imagine, CFOs and these types of people, it might not be too hard. If they're like a public company, you can listen to their quarterly investor briefing, and there alone, you're going to have the audio that you probably need to get any of the C-levels that you might target. So I look at that as being something that, is a way that we might see deepfake technology used to facilitate a business email compromise type of attack. But what I also think is cool is there's a lot of great technology that helps you identify, is it a deepfake? Tech can very easily spot deepfakes. But I think it's how do we get the tech in the right spot? So for example, it's easy to tell if it's a doctored audio, but how do you get that audio stream through something that detects it and it alerts the CFO the person in finance that they're actually not talking to, or that there's something fishy about this. And of course, then there's false positives in these things as well. And it's not going to be a perfect thing, but I do think technology has a role to play in protecting against misinformation, disinformation, and deepfakes.
So personally, I'm not aware of any specific technology that can detect deepfakes. Do you happen to know the name of one?
So I saw a couple of presentations at Black Hat last year that looked at this, and I don't remember off the top of my head, but they actually looked at using they trained mice to detect deepfake audio.
Oh wow!
Which is really interesting about how they went about this. But there were some neuroscientists from I think Stanford University, and they basically showed how. Well, they showed lots of different things, but one of the things that they showed was that when they broke down language into small pieces, that mice would react differently to the doctored versus the normal. And it was really interesting. I mean, some very smart people, but that was one approach to it. But also, I mean, just looking at the stream of data, and when something has been doctored by AI, there are markers of that, and the consistency of how certain things are done that are just not completely natural to how humans speak.
Yeah, it's becoming so good.
I'm very nervous about how this is going to unfold just because I think misinformation is a huge threat to society. I think technology has a role to play to, at least identify things like deepfakes. But, I just found it interesting going through like this election season and, how like, social media gets thrown under the bus and has to tag misinformation, but then mainstream media, spreads a lot of misinformation too, but nobody has to like tag any story on their site. And it's like, okay, well, at some point we're going to have a reconciliation here, and you have to figure out, how do we validate information so that we can inform ourselves without being misled. And I think it's going to be it's a big challenge to solve.
Oh, 100%. So I want to ask you about iOS and Android. What does your prediction look like for mobile threats in the coming year?
Yeah, so I think iOS certainly had sort of a 2020 moment this year, and I guess maybe just to rewind a bit from that is we're I guess entering year 13 now of the smartphone era, and iOS and Android have obviously our lives are very different today than they were before our smartphones, but unfortunately like the security track record of both Android and iOS is not great, and I remember going back all the way to like 2010. Every year at Black Hat, there would be some new, just devastating exploit for Android. And it would just, blow away any of the security protocols that were there. You could very easily root the device or, install an app that could root the device, and very, very easy to own the devices. And here we are today, all these years later, and, we continue to see security to be a very big challenge on these devices. And iOS or Apple will probably tell you that, they're extremely secure, but the reality is like, we just continue to see some very dangerous exploits. And, one that was discovered and disclosed by Google's Project Zero was a radio proximity exploit for iOS that took advantage of the iOS mesh network protocol, which is something that's like proprietary for Apple devices, but it helps them communicate with one another. And it's on by default. And so, one researcher over the course of 6 months basically built an exploit that, if you were next to his device, would own your device without any user interaction. And like on the Google Project Zero blog, it's a fantastic blog, by the way. At the very top, there's a video that just basically shows it. And he's got, I think, 30 different iPhones from like 2015 to current day. And like he runs the thing and you just watch them all within like 10 seconds, they all reboot.
Wow, that's crazy.
Like, whoa, right? And through that, he can install remote, so this is one researcher, right? So you can imagine nation states, they look at mobile devices as, the goal to, if they could infect one thing, it's going to be the mobile device of their target, because obviously, you don't have to explain to your users, what mobile devices do, but, it's obvious if you can compromise that, you have, it's a spy's like, happiest dream. So I think like from like a platform perspective, there's a lot of vulnerabilities still. But then we also look at like the app space, and maybe I'll pick on Android here instead of iOS, but there's what we call the Joker malware on Android that's been pretty prevalent over the past couple of years. There have been several 100,000 plus installs removed from Google Play, and often, these are just malicious apps that they like the app space is really cluttered, and so there's 1,000 different flashlight apps. But what they try to do is they go after what's popular, and they create a bare bones kind of app that kind of does it's a little flashlight or some other app like this. But then it contains like an advertising platform that contains Joker, and then slowly over the next several weeks of installation, components of Joker are then downloaded through that app, and ultimately what it does is it spies on the device, and then it monetizes through signing you up through like premium services. And so it will either buy other apps that are part of their network that costs money, or it will sign you up for recurring services. So that's like just one example. We see I think maybe the other thing I'm most concerned with on the mobile front is just the prevalence of what I call spy phone apps. And these are often things like, track your kids or, remote monitoring software for the phone. And oftentimes it's installed covertly. It's difficult to remove. And then it can report everything that you do with your device. So we see a lot of that. Like when we look at Webroot also has a mobile solution, and when we look at what do we see, what do we detect the most in the wild, it's definitely those types of apps.
Nice. Yeah, I didn't know Webroot had a mobile solution.
Yeah, actually, what's kind of cool about it is, so when you think about the mobile device, like Google continues to really lock down. They're trying to fix security, but really, like the internet browser is one of the areas that we see prime for exploitation, and that could be landing on a phishing site or be being misled some way. And so our latest release, actually, we pivot away from being an app itself, and we're basically built on the Chromium stack. So the benefit of that is like you can use Google Chrome browser, and we can still then protect that browsing experience. And then, of course, it protects as far as malicious apps. But the amount of malicious apps we see on mobile devices compared to malware on PCs is still a tiny fraction. But we really look at the browsing component is what we want to secure. So it provides both.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm always getting asked, is Apple more secure than Android devices?
Apple is more secure, but I don't think it's by like a large amount. And I think, if you look at Apple's patch notes for all of their recent releases, they've been there's a lot of security that they're constantly fixing. I think the application space for Apple is better because it's so controlled, right? Like it has to be Apple certified signed app to run. And Android, it's very easy to install apps from anywhere. So I think it's kind of like the flexibility of what you get. I think the app landscape for Android is more diverse than for iOS, but maybe iOS is a bit more secure just from the app space.
Understood. So Grayson, you're located out in the Denver area, right?
Yeah, Webroot's headquarters is actually in Broomfield, which is about 15 miles northwest of Denver.
Nice. So let's talk about the bar landscape. What's the best bar to go to out there?
Oh man, Colorado is we're really big into craft brew or beers, and so there's actually a lot of great restaurant bars that you can go in and have. Let's see, like the Boulder Beer Company. There's Avery Brewery. They're great that you go in, you try lots of different beers, and then they have tours that'll take you through the brewery house. That's kind of fun to do.
Oh, nice. So a lot of breweries. I know Coors is out there. Who else is out there?
We have lots of really small brews. So it's lots of microbrews. There's so many. But if you want maybe more of like a traditional bar, there's a place called the Burns Pub and Restaurant that's really famous in Broomfield, and it's right up by the Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport, and it is a fantastic Scotch bar, and they have some of the greatest old whiskeys and a menu of drinks that's several pages long, and fantastic food as well. So typically when we have people out from at least to the office, it's right next to our office, so that's often a really great place to go as well.
Sweet. So when you go out to a bar, what is your drink of choice?
I like beer. There's so many great microbreweries out here. We have several different tap houses that, it's just nice to try the variety. So I'm kind of a beer guy.
So it's last call here, Barcode. So I have one final question for you. If you opened a cybersecurity themed bar, what would the name be and what would your signature drink be called?
Oh my goodness, that's a hard question. What would I call my bar? I would call it. Oh man. Okay, maybe it could be like the Malicious Mixer.
Nice.
Okay, so that could be the bar name, and then we'd have like a variety of different like malware themed drinks. So we can have like the Trojan horse, like the ransomware. The spyware. These could be like different cocktails of of some sort.
Nice, as long as you don't get infected.
Well, you get infected, but just with the warm fuzzy feeling of alcohol.
It evades all defensive controls.
Indeed.
All right, well, Grayson, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for speaking with me and discussing your approach and mindset to InfoSec.
Chris, to you, thanks for reaching out, and this is a lot of fun. I love talking about cybersecurity, and perhaps I'll get to do one of these again in the future.
Definitely. Next time, let's catch up at a real bar.
Hey, you got it.
Barcode patrons, if you enjoyed this episode and want an easy way to support the podcast, please leave me a review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. If you're not on a Mac or iPhone, just visit thebarcodepodcast.com/reviews. I appreciate all the support. Cheers.
Unfortunately, it's time to shut the bar down for this episode. Thanks for stopping in. See you next time. We'll save you a seat. Be sure to check us out at thebarcodepodcast.com.